My name is Will Dobson. I'm the managing editor of Foreign Policy magazine. And it's my pleasure to welcome everyone to our second panel this morning. And we're going to make good on our pledge to answer the last question that was asked at the end of the first panel. So we haven't forgotten about you, don't worry. Today's second panel is entitled The Future of U.S.-Korea Alliance, Challenges, Opportunities, and Uncertainties. And we've heard about many of these uncertainties already today. Since the announcement earlier this week of North Korea's nuclear test, the focus swung very quickly to what this meant for everyone else, what this meant for the relationships and alliances, not just in the six-party talks, but also now, of course, up in New York at the Security Council. North Korea's act of defiance produced an immediate test for all these countries, and central among these relationships is the alliance between the United States and South Korea. That will be primarily the focus of what our experts on this panel today will be talking about. But we will expand it also to consider some of the other intricate and complex relationships among all these parties. What I'd like to do is now just very briefly introduce our panelists, who are a very distinguished lot, so distinguished that I cannot possibly read you their resumes. Go online, do Google searches, do your own research. You'll find very impressive people. But I'll highlight a few things. First off, Ambassador Chung-in. He asked that I not refer to him as ambassador, but then he gave me his business card and it said ambassador. So he's also, though, a professor of political science at Yonsei University in Seoul and ambassador for international security affairs in the Foreign Ministry of South Korea. Previously, he served as the dean of the Yonsei Graduate School of International Studies. He's an advisor to the National Security Council of the Office of the President, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade, the Ministry of National Defense, the Air Force, and is president of the Korea Peace Studies Association. So we're very, very honored that he can be here with us today and has made a trip all the way from Seoul to be able to make these remarks today. We will then hear from Don Oberdorfer. He's chairman of the U.S.-Korea Institute. Now, this is something you need to know right away. The U.S.-Korea Institute was inaugurated a week ago. Talk about good timing. And it's going to be housed at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, where he's also a journalist in residence. He was a diplomatic correspondent for the Washington Post for 17 years and author of The Two Koreas. Given our partnership with the Woodrow Wilson School, I'd be very remiss to not add that he's an alum of the Woodrow Wilson School and an advisor to their advisory council. So I suppose you have maybe the most friendly audience of everyone on the panel. We're also very happy to be joined by Balbina Hwang. She has got an incredible resume going back with a lot of experience on the Korean Peninsula and is today a senior policy analyst for Northeast Asia in the Asian Studies Center of the Heritage Foundation. She's also the editor of U.S. Korea Tomorrow, a quarterly magazine, which I would highly recommend to all of you who are looking for more information about what we're talking about today. Also, we're joined by Jae Koo, who's the director of North Korea programs at Freedom House. Before joining Freedom House, he was a postdoctoral fellow at the Watson Institute for International Studies at Brown University and taught international relations there. He's researched at various think tanks, not just in Washington at CSIS, but also in Seoul and also in Hanoi. So we're very happy that he can be with us today to give us a wider perspective of some of the questions that recent news raises. And then finally, last but not least, Nicholas Eberstadt, who is the Henry Wentz Scholar in Political Economy at the American Enterprise Institute. He researches demographics, foreign aid, poverty, infant mortality, health disparities, and economic development. And yes, I edited this list down to just those things. He does much more, including having written extensively on Korea and East Asia. His books include The End of North Korea and the forthcoming North Korean Economy. So we're very happy he can be with us today as well. So our panelists have pledged to me that they are going to be succinct and brief in their comments so that we can have a very healthy and lively exchange, because I'm sure that everything they're going to have to say is going to raise many questions in your minds. We'll maintain a good balance of our time for that. So without any further ado, Ambassador.
Mr. Dobson, thank you very much for your kind introduction. I came all the way from Seoul, Korea, to give a 7-minute presentation. Wonderful investment. But thank God, at least this panel has South Korean presence too. Therefore, I hope I can balance some of those claims made in the first session and second session. I would argue that ROK-US alliance has been one of the most successful alliances in the world. In a sense, it's better than NATO. Okay, to the extent it was extremely successful. Alliance cohesiveness was extremely outstanding. Why? Because there was a shared threat perception between U.S. and South Korea. North Korea was #1 enemy, and also during the Cold War period, all this communist bloc was our common enemy. There was a shared threat perception between Seoul and Washington that really strengthened the ROK-US alliance. There was also common interest too. Okay, U.S. and South Korea were interested in promoting peace and stability in Northeast Asia and on the Korean Peninsula. There was shared an interest too, or complementary to national interest between the two countries. And third there was shared common values. Okay, as you all know, that the South Korea has been greatest beneficiary of American values. We were most successful in turning our economy from one of the poorest country, we turned into the 11th largest economy in the world as a result of American push for capitalist economy, as a result of American push for export-led growth strategy. And also South Korea has been one of the most ardent implementer of a democracy. Therefore, South Korea is very few countries which were able to achieve, economic growth and democracy. And that was really, owing to the great extent, it was a result of American policy in Korea. Therefore, there are common shared values too. And also in terms of institutionalization of military cooperation, there's no match. Why? Because we have a mutual defense treaty, we have a combined forces command, we have a unity of command between ROK and the US, we had a joint military maneuver, we have American troop presence in South Korea, and South Korea has been paying for the defense burden sharing, defense cost sharing. Okay. And also we have been sending our troops to Vietnam and Iraq. Therefore, in view of this, South Korea and the United States have been able to maintain enormously high degree of institutionalization of military cooperation between the two countries. And also, in terms of domestic political and social support, there has been enormous positive factor. In South Korea, South Koreans really believed the United States was a savior of South Korea and South Korean people. Okay, we believe that the United States saved us from the calamitic outcomes of the Korean War. That we are really grateful to the United States. Even though there was some kind of indifference on the part of the United States, but still there's a kind of good feeling and good perception of South Korea by American peoples. In view of all these things, the alliance between ROK and US was extremely outstandingly, successful one. But since the inauguration of the Nomian government, or participatory government, there's some cacophonies. Some people were saying that there is a kind of sunset divorce because we marked the 50th anniversary of ROK-US alliance about 3 years ago, and therefore some people have been arguing that there must be some amicable divorce between the two countries and all these kinds of things. But I think that really, belie the actual reality of ROK-US alliance. In fact, during the Nomian government, it has been extremely supportive of the alliance because Nomian, despite the enormous domestic political opposition, he sent troops to Iraq. And at the same time, during the no-till government period, that the South Korean government promised to relocate the Yongsan base to the other area, but they couldn't deliver it. But it was Nomian government which delivered the relocation of Yongsan base to Pyeongtaek area, so that U.S. can have a consolidated military base in South Korea. And also, the Nomian government really resolved a lot of unresolved issues between the two countries. Yet, his government was branded as a kind of anti-American government. I think it's really misleading interpretation of the Nomian government. Why? I think partly because of the way he got elected as a president, because there was a tragic death of 2 high school girls, and there was a subsequently there was enormous, anti-American, demonstration, and in the middle of the demonstration, he got elected as the president of the Republic of Korea. Therefore, some people thought that Norman, kind of misused the anti-American sentiment for his, political, benefit, but it is not. But because that kind of misunderstanding has, led to the misunderstanding of Norman government per se. But if you understand in an objective manner, you will have a different, picture of the Norman government. But there is another problem. That problem is the whole threat perception of North Korea. We South Koreans believe that North Korea is a threat. But we're trying to change North Korea from a threat to a partner through exchange and cooperation, through opening and reform of North Korean society. Therefore, we are somewhat contradictory. On the one hand, we perceive North Korea as a threat, but on the other hand, we believe North Korea as a partner to be changed into our partner for peaceful coexistence. But on the other hand, the United States tend to believe that North Korea is the main enemy, and North Korea is to be isolated and contained, and eventually perhaps transformed, given the nature of North Korean regime. Therefore, there was some kinds of incongruity between South Korea and the United States on the threat perception of North Korea. Therefore, the kinds of gap in the threat perception led to the somewhat sour relationship between the two countries. Another issue is a more recent issue. There has been some effort to make a rearrangement of mode of operation between the ROK and the U.S., and particularly with regard to the return or transfer of wartime operational control from the Combined Forces Command, which is headed by which is commanded by the Commander of American Forces in South Korea, to South Korea. But I really don't think it is all about alliance, because that is just the minor part of alliance management. Okay? We are changing from the combined command structure to a parallel command structure like in Japan. But I think the U.S. wanted that kind of transfer because it can enhance the strategic flexibility of American forces. Because in the age of a new uncertainty, American military asset in South Korea cannot be seen as a fixed asset. They should be movable. Okay? But this transfer of this operational command, wartime operational command, can help U.S. to pursue more flexible relocation of its military asset in South Korea. And at the same time, South Korea can contribute more to the alliance by taking more competent defense posture. But anyhow, that has become, that is not the really debate between ROK and United States. It was a so-called source of friction in South Korean politics between liberals, progressive on the one hand, and conservative on the other hand. Third major issue that has undermined some kind of alliance ties between two countries is a changing attitude of young generation in South Korea. And young generation in South Korea tend to be somewhat more, tend to, be more confident about their own, posture. At the same time, they tend to pursue the more nationalistic, the posture. And that kind of attitude has weakened the socio-political support of the alliance in South Korea. And then, in view of these three factors, there is a threat perception issue, and secondly is changes in institutionalization of military cooperation, and third one is changing domestic social and political attitude, particularly by young generation. Those three factors have been some kind of sources of erosion of ROK's alliances. Then how about the future? I think the North Korean nuclear testing really saved the ROK-US alliance, and I think there will be a common threat between, there will be shared common threat between Washington and Seoul. Therefore, in the short term, there will be strengthening of ROK-US alliance. But in the medium to long term, threat-based alliance itself cannot really bind the two countries. There must be value-based and capability-based alliance should be forged between two countries. There should be the future vision of the alliance between the two countries. And then that leads to the second important mandate. That is what we South Koreans, what unified Korea will want, an order of mutual cooperation and integration in Northeast Asia. We would reject any kind of regional order that support confrontation, distrust, and divisiveness in the area. Therefore, I personally hope that ROK-US alliance should be oriented toward creating new order for cooperation, harmony, and integration in Northeast Asia. United States has proven that capability in the European theater, and I strongly believe that U.S. can deliver it to Northeast Asia too. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much for inviting me. As Will said, yes, I'm a graduate of the Woodrow Wilson School. And I went right from the Woodrow Wilson School to Korea, where I was a second lieutenant, the exalted rank of second lieutenant in the days immediately after the end of the Korean War. So I've been dealing with Korea one way or another for, I figure, around 53 years, which may mean that my ideas have somewhat calcified, but it also gives me an opportunity to look back over time. I think it's necessary to think of Korea as an ecosystem. Both Koreas. This is one country, one culture, one people that were just divided by accident, really, by the United States in 1945. What happens in North Korea has a tremendous effect on South Korea, and vice versa. The South Korean leadership, and some at least of the North Korean leadership, and at least some of the North Korean people, those who are listening to the radios that we talked about on the last panel, are very aware of what's going on in South Korea. Now, the current circumstance with the nuclear test that took place a few days ago will bring change to the U.S.-South Korean relationship, even as it's brought change already to the change in the relationship with North Korea. There's a debate in the United States about using force against North Korea, what some people in Washington call the B-2 factor, the B-2 bomber. It's often, it seems to me, it takes no account of how all this would play in South Korea. South Korea is obviously a very, very vital factor, not only in U.S. policy, but on the peninsula as a whole. As Professor Moon has said, it's a democratic country, it's an increasingly prosperous country, it's an important ally of the United States. Moreover, it's their country. North Korea is part of their country. So it behooves the United States to pay attention to what the views are in South Korea. To me, the two big dates that underlie this way in which we're going to have to deal with each other is not so much the election of Roh Moo-hyun in the year 2002, but 1987, when Korea became a democratic country with a little shove from the United States, but really of their own doing, and the year 2000, when former President Kim Dae-jung went to Pyongyang, the capital of North Korea, held up the hand of Kim Jong-il, and suddenly the views toward North Korea in the South changed almost overnight to the kind of thing that Professor Moon was talking about, in which they want to, on the one hand, work with North Korea, and on the other hand, they see North Korea as a dangerous place. My own sense is that we have not really yet got the full reaction of the South Korean public to the nuclear test. I think it's going to be a very great reaction when it finally sets in. People in South Korea knew, of course, that the North Korea is working on nuclear weapons. That's been a target of an object of discussion for many, many years. But I think they were not fully prepared for the fact that North Korea had achieved a nuclear weapon. When this sinks in, it's going to have a powerful impact in South Korean public opinion and politics. It's already beginning to have that impact. I think the impact is going to be much greater. This is going to cause difficulties in the alliance between the United States and the Republic of Korea. Washington has its own views, and Washington looks at the North Korean nuclear problem really in a worldwide perspective because of the problems of the spread of nuclear weapons throughout the world. And about the possibility that some of this material could leak out to terroristic organizations in the Middle East and elsewhere. South Korea is not, it doesn't ignore those things, but its views are largely peninsular. It's there. It's next door. It doesn't really fear an attack by North Korea with their nuclear weapons, but it does fear that this will cause the United States, perhaps Japan, to take some drastic measures which could lead to war. So for the South Koreans, this is an event of a great magnitude. I don't know what on the Richter scale, but somewhere up there on the Richter scale. How it all plays out, we don't yet know. In the background of this are the things which Professor Moon also mentioned, the changes in U.S. military policies in South Korea, the question of giving the South Korean military operational control during wartime, which has not been the case in the past, the redeployment of American forces, all of these things which are in the air and are in public debate and discussion in South Korea as they should be. And let us not forget, an election, national election for president is coming up in South Korea in about 1 year. And after that, about a year after that, is the national election for president in the United States of America. So there may be great changes, and this is a time, a particularly politically sensitive time, in Korea and also in the United States. My own view is that the reaction of the Korean people, the South Korean people, is very much open. I don't think it's really clearly gelled yet. There are indications that the ruling party, the Uri party, is losing even further, losing support among the South Korean people, are less enamored of trying to work with North Korea than they were in the past. But it's which way it's going to go, I don't know. I do believe it's going to be a powerful reaction. I was asked if I had time, and I don't have much, but I'll just refer to this to talk about the reaction of other parties in Northeastern Asia to the North Korean nuclear test. China is obviously the most important of the non-Korean parties in Northeastern Asia to all this. I believe that the Chinese attitude toward North Korea has been shifting before this, most notably after the North Korean missile tests, which took place in July, and even before that. For China, North Korea has always been a, quote, special relationship. It was the Chinese who saved North Korea from being annihilated by General MacArthur in 1950. And they've always had a very, very close relationship. But now, it is no longer that. It has now been told to Chinese diplomats and others, it's a, quote, normal relationship. This may sound like mere substitution of a couple of words, but what it may mean, as I understand it means, that different people in the People's Republic of China are in charge of the relationship with North Korea. It's not the security services and the military so much anymore as it is the voice of the normal diplomatic and leadership groups in China, which will determine how China works with North Korea. We see in the current UN debate, China is careful not to go too far. Finally, there is Japan. And Japanese policy has, over the past several years, especially since the North Korean missile test in 1998, in which a missile flew over the Japanese islands out to the Pacific, turned very harshly against North Korea, and also become much more fixed on buildup of military forces than was the case in the past. If there's any one thing that could possibly unite North Korea and South Korea, it would be some kind of threat from Japan, because Japan is not popular in either country. They occupied Korea for 35 years in an occupation which was not noted for its subtlety. I would say. So we don't know exactly what is going to happen in the Korean Peninsula, but I think that the actions of the North Korean government exploding a nuclear device on Korean soil in the past few days is going to have a powerful impact, and we're going to find out anon what direction this impact will take. Thanks very much.
Because this morning, first thing I did when I woke up was picked up the paper just to make sure that North Korea didn't set off some kind of other nuclear test overnight. And also to check my horoscope, because the first question everybody asks is, what's going to happen next, right? So I figure might as well get some inspiration from, wherever I can get it. In addition to which, today is Friday the 13th. My horoscope today, of course, tells me that I should beware of large crowds. So I didn't feel that I was off to a very good start. So please forgive me for being a little bit nervous this morning. Now, I feel a little bit better because Professor Moon and Don Oberdorfer have done such an excellent job in really saying quite a bit of what I had wanted to say, so that makes my job a little bit easier. But I would like to delve into a couple of the themes that were brought up, just explore these issues just a little bit more. Clearly, this nuclear test once again puts the spotlight on U.S. relations with South Korea and our alliance. Yet recently, in the previous months and years, there has been quite a lot of lamenting being done about the demise of the alliance. And I suspect that North Korea's calculations in setting off this nuclear test, the perceived frictions and tensions in the alliance certainly must have factored in to those strategic calculations. Now, those who lament, wring their hands, and they're beginning to write the drafts of the epitaph for the alliance, cite numerous issues and problems, and they were detailed quite eloquently by Professor Moon. Rise of anti-Americanism in South Korea, different approaches to North Korea, Korean desires to be more independent, the rising costs of the alliance. The lists go on and on. Unfortunately, the proposed solution to this problem is to end the alliance, and it could not be more wrong, in my view. Legitimate differences about the function, the purpose, the utility of the alliance have, in fact, arisen due to dramatic shifts in the domestic, regional, and global environment. But just as the alliance is not the cause of these tensions in the bilateral relationship, we should also not allow the alliance itself to become its victim. So what we need to do is really address the real sources and the topic of this panel, which is the challenges facing the relationship. So I'd like to explore that a little bit with you. Now, the most fundamental challenge is what the continued rationale for the alliance is. Why do states form alliances? The very simple political science answer is when faced with common external threats, states, like-minded or not in terms of shared values, etc., come together to create mutual security. Now, South Korea and the U.S. perhaps are the classic case of how an alliance was born out of acute security threat. And, by the way, as Professor Moon pointed out, it has actually been one of the most successful cases of an alliance, perhaps in U.S. history. But despite these successes, many believe the alliance is, unfortunately, in crisis today. And they argue that the very raison d'etre of the alliance, the fact that we share a common threat, no longer exists. So that while the United States continues to view North Korea as a threat, South Koreans no longer do. Now, I myself have made this argument for the public record several years ago, but I began to realize that I was actually quite wrong. It is wrong to say that South Koreans do not see North Korea as a threat, and I'm not just talking about post-nuclear explosion. South Koreans absolutely do feel a threat from North Korea. It is just that they view the threat in a very different way from the United States. The U.S. sees the threat based on the strength of the North Korean regime. By the way, this is unchanged from throughout the Cold War, right? we Americans continue to see North Korea's military first policy, its missile proliferation, its certainly its nuclear programs, even its human rights abuses. These are all factors that stem from the strength of the North Korean regime. But for South Koreans, what they feel most is the weakness of the North Korean regime, not its strength. The potential for a chaotic collapse, either through some kind of implosion or even an explosion. So the sources of the threat, North Koreans' belligerence, their tough rhetoric, their recalcitrance in refusing to negotiate at the six-party talks, these all stem from the regime's fundamental weakness. But the important point, I believe here, is to understand why. Why have we reached the strategic dissonance between these two allies? Now, many attribute the change to the Sunshine Policy and the June 2000 summit. And I think Don's point of pointing out the pivotal pieces of history, 1987 and 2000, are certainly correct. But something very important happened between those two dates. The June 2000 summit was really the powerful symbol of that dramatic shift, the overnight shift, as Don described it. But the roots of the shift are actually found a decade earlier, in the 1990s, first with the collapse of the Soviet Union, then the opening up of China. But really, and most importantly, it was the famines and the floods and the devastation of the North Korean economy. And it was when we began to see images for the first time of starving, skeletal children coming out of North Korea. That was the single most profound shock for South Korean citizens. Suddenly, South Koreans who had been brought up to fear North Koreans, there's monthly drills every day in the streets of Seoul to prepare for an imminent attack. You're taught in school that they're the enemy. Suddenly, they saw not the devil, a brutal, powerful enemy intent on killing them, but poor, starving, and desperate people that were really more pity than to be feared. Most importantly, they saw fellow Koreans. And at best, they were viewed as victims of a terrible regime, and certainly an international community that was bent on branding them as rogues or a bad state and isolating them, and at worst, victims of a misguided dictator whose time is obviously running out. Now, if you live in Seoul, only 35 kilometers from the DMZ, this view is perfectly understandable. But to those of us here an ocean away, or even a sea away if you're in Japan, it is very difficult, if not impossible, to not feel threatened by North Korea. So both sides may be perfectly legitimate in their views about North Korea, but the problem is what we are now left with is this strategic dissonance between the two allies. Now, this dissonance, I believe, is at the heart of much of the anti-U.S. or anti-American sentiments that are being exhibited in South Korea today, that all of you present, especially the media, is so good at perpetuating, making sure that all of us see this, because the strategic dissonance. Now, because the United States continues to maintain a very strong stance against North Korea, and the United States has suddenly become a symbol of preventing the reconciliation, the cooperation, the partnership that Professor Moon talked about, and ultimately, perhaps, a peaceful unification of the Korean Peninsula. So today, the alliance has become the victim. The alliance itself has become the symbol of these fundamentally different strategic views towards North Korea. And its utility is being questioned by both sides. And that is why I think you have this focus on all of the issues of burden sharing, all of the specific disagreements and tensions between the two militaries, between the two governments. Not that these issues are not important, but remember, these issues have always existed for the last 50 years. Disagreements about SOFA, about the presence of the U.S. footprint on the Korean Peninsula. These issues are not new. The role and the activities of the American forces on the Korean Peninsula, again, not new. But we are suddenly seeing them in a new light with a new focus. On a final note, there is one other very important point affecting the alliance dynamics today, and again, also already discussed by my predecessors. And it is, of course, the immense changes that have occurred in the southern half of the Korean Peninsula. The democratization, the incredible economic vibrance and activity, the emergence of one of the most vibrant civil societies, perhaps in East Asia. I don't need to tell this audience all of these factors. But we should also note the immense changes that have occurred in the United States, particularly after 9/11. Sounds like a cliche, but it isn't. For Americans, our strategic view of the world was fundamentally shattered in that one moment. So the point is, we cannot return to the past, and perhaps we shouldn't. The alliance for over 50 years stood for something extremely important and was a huge success, but we are now in a new environment. It doesn't mean we should abandon the alliance. What it means is that we need to think about how we can sustain a new alliance for the new challenges of the future. The nuclear test shows that the challenges have not gone away. In fact, they've been raised to a whole new level. But beyond the immediacy of the issues of North Korea and the future of the peninsula are broader interests for both countries. They involve the region and the power dynamics, and really not just stability for the region, but really about the future of global stability. And the alliance can play a positive and a critical role. Now, it's uncertain what the nuclear test will have, what the effects of the nuclear test will have on the alliance. I'm a little bit more cynical about that the South Koreans will fundamentally have changed their view about North Korea, precisely because of the profound changes that I've already discussed. I think those changes don't go away, regardless of whether North Korea, Kim Jong-il, the funny man, the funny little short man with an odd fashion style, may have set off a bomb, but for most South Koreans, still North Koreans are now viewed as fellow brothers and sisters. And that doesn't go away. So what it may do certainly is change the way in which we change our strategy and our coordination, which is all certainly a positive development. But we should keep this in mind as we move forward, because very clearly cooperation in the alliance will be critical to any success in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Will. Of Foreign Policy Magazine, Steve Barnes of Woodrow Wilson School, Princeton University, and the National Press Club. I would like to focus my comments on the importance of public perception in U.S.-ROK relations, both here and in South Korea. Public opinion matters because public opinion in democratic societies can influence policy makers and policy outcomes. Some of the issues that I'm going to address have been already mentioned and alluded to, but I'm going to go delve into further, and hopefully being I think the most junior ranking member on the panel, I'm going to put myself out there and make some bold comments. By delving into the divergences in public perception, I think that's very real. I have to make a couple of observations about the alliance. I believe that as North Korea's nuclear blackmail continues to intensify, the South Korean public will feel more insecure, and this will lead to more antipathy towards the United States. And this antipathy will be greatly politicized in Seoul leading up to next year's presidential election, and will have a boomerang effect on U.S. public perception and response. Let me start by asking the question, who benefits from a North Korean nuclear detonation? When I was in Seoul over the summer, I would ask this question, but not ask about nuclear detonation. I talked about a missile launch. If North Korea successfully launched a missile and it landed somewhere near Hawaii or Alaska, who would benefit from this, the conservatives or the progressives? It didn't strike me until earlier this week to ask that question here on the U.S. side. Having spoken with some of the congressional Republican staffers, they were fairly relieved that this had shifted attention away from Iraq and domestic scandal involving ex-Congressman Mark Foley. But on the Korean side, seemingly this helps the GNP and the conservatives. According to a recent Social Trend Institute survey of 700 adults nationwide that came out this, I think, on Tuesday in the Korea Herald, 64% of South Korean respondents said Ro's policy, that is President Roh Moo-hyun's policy, had not played a role in resolving the tension. In another question, 52% blamed Kim Jong-il for the intensification on the Korean Peninsula. 11% blamed Roe. So one can conclude that 63%, if you add those two figures, view the sunshine policy as having failed or having a very critical view of it. And a significant number, 31% of the respondents blamed President George Bush for North Korea's nuclear detonation. But I'm not sure that this view, this anti-sunshine view, will endure. Why? 70% of the respondents said that they felt insecure. In another question, 29% fear that the recent nuclear test could lead to an actual war between North Korea and the United States. 30% thought the U.S. might attack North Korea's nuclear facilities. In any case, 60% feel that some kind of military conflict will arise on the Korean Peninsula. My view is that this percentage will greatly increase as the U.S. begins to impose greater and tighter sanctions. If Kim Jong-il decides on a second blast or another missile launch prior to next year's election, the South Korean public will really be on its edge. If you recall, 31% of the respondents blamed President George Bush. And as rhetoric in D.C. intensifies over North Korea and the U.S. publicly debates the merits of preemptive strike, in Korea, there will be no left or right on this issue. All Koreans will be united against the U.S. military action. Now, given this backdrop, how will politics exacerbate the alliance? In the last presidential election, highlighted the progressive and the conservative dichotomy and the generational split. While this was true to a certain extent, in Korean politics, regionalism is still the single most powerful explanatory variable. That is, your birthplace, your parents' birthplace, continue to have large sway over politics. Too often, regionalism is seen only in the context of voting. We think in terms of 90% of people from the southwest two provinces of Chola voted for Kim Dae-jung, Roh Moo-hyun, etc. But in fact, regionalism plays a much more complex role. It is a filter in which the totality of politics is viewed. For example, and this comes from my research, in social science, you basically have 4 standard questions you ask to measure one's trust in government. Things like, do you trust the government in Washington or in Seoul? Do you think the government wastes a lot of taxes? Do you think the government is for the rich and the powerful? In Korea, you get about 35% of people who trust the government. We could categorize this as a low-trust society. But what the research shows is that the respondents viewed this question through a filter. Do I trust this particular government? And at the time, this particular government was Kim Dae-jung's. And true enough, the respondents' answers to questions evaluating regime performance, evaluation of specific policies, direction of the country, whether it's going right or wrong, were all determined by your birthplace. So what does all this mean? Now, if you look at the polls that come out regularly in Korea, you can pretty much guess who the supporters and the detractors are. Earlier, I cited the survey's figure that 31% blame George Bush. I bet that a statistically significant number comes from the southwest province of Chola. This certainly reflects Kim Dae-jung's recent statements, former President Kim Dae-jung's recent statements squarely blaming the nuclear detonation on the U.S. So what does this all mean? As one nears the December 2007 presidential election in Seoul, the progressive core that so successfully rode anti-American sentiments in 2002 will be looking for ways to shore up its support, that is, shore up its southwest base, and then try to go after the number needed to win the election. And given the backdrop that 70% of the South Koreans feel insecure about this, you could be pretty certain that I think one of the campaign tactics will be to ratchet up anti-American sentiments. And not just anti-American sentiments, anti-Japanese sentiments as well. And you're already seeing this in South Korean domestic politics. Now, recently, over the summer, there was a Gallup poll that asked the question, do you approve or disapprove of the leaders of the countries? And U.S. came in third with 23%. After China, which got the highest with 36%, Russia 26%, US 23%, and Japan at 14%. Now, on the US side, public support for the alliance is decreasing. I worked on a Johns Hopkins Science opinion survey a couple of years ago of Americans on a whole range of Korea and Asia-related issues. The survey revealed that a majority of Americans hold a favorable view of South Korea, critical view of North Korea, and a stable outlook regarding the future of US-ROK relations. Now, while the finding suggests that the US public is very supportive of South Korea, there are subtle but significant changes occurring within the American public. Those who hold the most favorable and supportive views of South Korea are largely older Americans. They also tend to hold a very hostile view of North Korea. However, younger Americans are less likely to hold supportive views when it comes to South Korea or negative views when it comes to North Korea. Some 40% of Americans thought that South Korea was a neutral country or an unfriendly country towards the US. This after some 50 years of alliance. To a certain extent, the distinctions between the two Koreas are becoming more blurred to the younger generation of Americans, and the implications of these findings are many. The most significant implication is that in both countries, the core supporters of US-ROK alliance and cooperation come from the older generations. And given the logic of aging, the support base for close US-ROK relations could only continue to decrease. Thank you very much.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, there's good news and there's bad news about the ongoing North Korean nuclear crisis. And the good news is that one of the governments involved in the six-party talks really does have a carefully thought-out strategy for how to end the impasse and break the logjam. The bad news is it's North Korea. And we've just seen what that strategy looks like. North Korea has very firm and invariable intentions. We've seen this over the past years, decades. The DPRK wants to build a nuclear arsenal, and it wants to build a fleet of long-range intercontinental ballistic missiles so that it can marry its nuclear weapons to ICBMs so that it can hit the U.S. territory. And it doesn't do this out of any particular sentimental impulse, although I suppose there might be some pleasure involved. It does so for quite instrumental and utilitarian reasons, because pointing a nuclear gun at the United States heartland inescapably undermines the credibility of the U.S. military support for the ROK and the ROK-U.S. military alliance. Now, if that were the only problem the U.S. ROK military alliance faced at the moment, it would be problem enough. But I'm afraid we have other and perhaps equally significant problems. And central in many, if not most of these problems, is what was initially called the Sunshine Policy. The Sunshine Policy, or as it's later called the Engagement Policy, or as it is sometimes called the Policy for Peace and Prosperity, is a cancer eating at the U.S. ROK alliance. Let me explain why I say this. The intentions of the Sunshine Policy are noble. Those intentions are a peaceful reconciliation of North and South and a transformation of the DPRK regime from a revisionist totalitarian state into an open and normal country. And I should be diplomatic about this. As implemented, the Sunshine Policy was a fraud and an illusion. Why do I say a fraud? Let's go back to the historic North-South summit in Pyongyang on June 15th, year 2000. The seeming diplomatic breakthrough that, of course, led to the awarding of a Nobel Peace Prize to then President of South Korea. What we now know about those fantastic atmospherics is that they were a purchased ceremony. At South Korean money, perhaps as much as $500 million, but at least, according to subsequent court accounts, at least $100 million in taxpayer money, went to Kim Jong-il in order to hold this spectacle. And even better than that, the summit was delayed by a day. You may remember this, it was delayed by a day. Why was it delayed by a day? Because the payment hadn't cleared in Kim Jong-il's bank accounts in Macau. True story. In court records, in South Korea, in the transcripts of the progenitors of Sunshine Policy who were convicted of jail time by the end of the DJ administration. Why do I say an illusion? Because from the moment the president of South Korea returned to the tarmac in the South, the notion was put forward that war in the Korean peninsula is no longer possible. That North Korea was no longer the threat that it had been imagined before, but was now somehow a partner in peace in some sort of inter-Korean dream castle that was going to be built. This is a problem for an international military alliance that is predicated on the rationale of a North Korean threat. And without going through every sorry step and stage over the 6 years since then, we have seen this notion, this illusory notion of the absence of North Korean threat eating at the heart of the US-ROK alliance. And not unreasonably, because if one were an interested member of the South Korean public, and one were informed by one's government that the nature of the North Korean threat has dramatically changed and dramatically reduced, one might reasonably ask, what are American soldiers doing in our country now, besides gracing the bars in Itaewon and occasionally running over our daughters? And this, indeed, is what we have seen, as this strain in the alliance progressively increases. We've been living through, ladies and gentlemen, an era of illusion. It's not the first era of illusions in international relations. We had an era of illusions in another part of the world in an earlier time that some of our senior statesmen are old enough to remember. Balbina mentioned earlier the funny little man with the odd fashion style. There was a funny little man with an odd fashion style in that earlier era of illusions in Europe. There was conference diplomacy, where one side liked to talk and the other side liked to arm, just as we see today. That earlier era of illusion in Europe is now referred to by historians as the interwar era. I don't think it is yet known whether we similarly live in an interwar era in Northeast Asia. But I think that we can dramatically reduce the risk that we are living in an interwar era by revitalizing the US-ROK alliance. Revitalizing the US-ROK military alliance will require coming back to a shared vision on two critical points. One is the nature of the North Korean threat. The other is the nature and a vision of what a post-DPRK Korean peninsula should look like in Northeast Asia. These, I think, are big challenges. They're not insurmountable challenges. And I myself actually have some confidence that these challenges can be grasped and met. The first stage in meeting these challenges is to abandon and repudiate the sunshine, engagement, peace and prosperity policy of appeasement of an essentially unappeasable revisionist regime and all of the illusions that have been promoted by that fraught pursuit. Thank you.
Well, Well, I want to thank all of our panelists. They've certainly given us a great deal to think about and raised a number of interesting points, and as importantly, preserved the time that you all need to pose questions to them. So we have about 30 minutes left in the balance of our time, and we have microphones placed over here and over on this other side as well. I'd ask that what we asked before be true for this panel as well, that you identify yourself, give your affiliation, and keep it to a question, because I suspect that we have a number of people who have points or questions they'd like to pose, and we'd like to get as many people as possible. So perhaps we'll begin right here.
I'm Joe Anderson from Capital Research Associates, and a question, I guess, for the whole panel. We read that China is very concerned and opposed to reunification of North and South Korea, and perceive that as creating a country that would be dominated economically by South Korea and allied to the United States. So I'd like for the panelists to comment on that, and also what is the stated and the actual policy of both the United States and Japan toward reunification.
Who would like to take that up first? Don?
Well, I think you're right about China. I mean, that's exactly right. They're concerned about a reunified Korea on their border, a very long border, which might be allied to the United States if it's dominated by South Korea. So, yeah, that's true. What was the second part?
The attitude and the policy of the U.S. and Japan toward reunification.
Well, the United States has never been opposed to reunification. In fact, it's in favor of reunification. It would want to see it come about in a sensible and rational way, but so would South Koreans, and for that matter, North Koreans. Regarding Japan, I think the Japanese would be somewhat nervous about a reunified Korea. There is all the bad blood of history between Japan and Korea, both North and South. But I can't see them doing anything to actually try to stop it if the Koreans themselves decided they were going in that direction.
Chinese traditional policy on Korean unification is what they call the Putong Plan. That means neither unification nor disorder, instability on the Korean Peninsula. Therefore, China tends to favor status quo on the Korean Peninsula. As the United States has been officially pursuing the peaceful unification of Korea, the unification through consensus. But beneath that one, the United States might want Korean unification on the South Korean terms, meaning liberal democracy and capitalism. Japan, against status quo, they favor status quo.
Balbina.
I think in this discussion about unification, we forget something. The question is not very simply either does one country favor unification or does it not. It matters very much what we mean by unification. In other words, on whose terms. Now, implicit in your question was the blanket assumption, which I think almost everybody tends to make, which is that unification will occur in South Korean terms. It's very difficult to imagine it will be on North Korean terms. But as Nick Eberstadt points out, that's not certainly what North Korea wants. And there is certainly the possibility that it could happen not on South Korean terms, meaning in a democratic, in some sort of a formulation where it's relatively open, democratic, open markets, and so on. So that matters critically. And by the way, South Koreans are not necessarily for unification today. So the point is we have to expand that debate a little bit further to entail a clear description of what we mean, but also what we mean by the timing, because I think timing is very important.
When you talk about Korean unification, there are many different modalities of Korean unification. It could be take the form of a commonwealth, it could be a union of states, it could be confederation, federation, or one single unified nation state. But it would be extremely difficult for us to envisage one single unified nation state unless North Korea collapses, unless there is a war on the Korean Peninsula and one side winning the other. Therefore, what South Korean policy has been pursuing the so-called state of union, union of state first, and then getting into confederation, and by then we can anticipate major structural changes in North Korea in favor of capitalism and liberal democracy. Then we can have national referendum on whether we can have one single unified state or not.
Let's take a question from the other corner.
Hi, I'm Seth Elan from the Library of Congress. I'm a Princeton graduate. I would like to focus on Japan and the new Japanese Prime Minister, Abe. What is his reaction likely to be in terms of defense and science and technology policy?
Nick, do you want to take this one? No, you don't.
Don.
Don?
Well, as I said earlier, Japan for quite a while, ever since 1998, has been increasing its defense capabilities, largely out of concern about North Korea, and this, of course, would greatly deepen that concern. The main line of speculation is whether Japan is going to go for its own nuclear weapons program. And there are people who assume that that will come. I don't think we can assume it. I think there is a greater possibility today than there was in the past. The Japanese people are the only people on Earth who have been the target of nuclear weapons. The nuclear weapons dropped on Nagasaki and Hiroshima by the United States in 1945, and there's been a very strong anti-nuclear feeling among the Japanese people, which has not gone away entirely. But Abe, in his early days, his first days as Prime Minister, has gone out of his way to travel to China, to travel to South Korea, to try to have some meeting of minds, and also, I think, to try to allay the fears and suspicions that he was going to come on in a highly nationalistic way, which was going to make more difficult the relations between Japan and its neighbors. I think the jury's out about what Japan will do, and Abe, in one sense, Abe being supported by the conservatives in Japan doesn't need to do as much to show his conservative support as his predecessor. But I think he's quite naturally conservative. I expect the Japanese military budget will rise further. How far it goes, whether they're going to go toward a nuclear weapons program, I think is unpredictable at this moment.
Yeah, please.
It is very unlikely for Japan, even under Abe, to go for the nuclear, nuclearization because of American opposition. If America want, yes, Japan can have it. If America want, South Korea can have nuclear weapons. But if America said no, it won't be possible. And second, no matter how conservative Abe's posture might be, he will be pursuing set of military policies within constraint of Japan-U.S. alliances. Therefore, Japan will be kind of junior partner for missile defense system development and other kinds of things. However, from institutional point of view, Mr. Abe would strongly push for the amendment of peace constitution changing Article 9 of Article 9, Section 2 of the peace constitution, therefore making Japan a normal state, so Japan can pursue just having a regular army.
Okay, please.
Deborah Lindy, retired State Department and Woodrow Wilson alum. My question is related. If Japan were to go nuclear, and speculation is that it would take approximately 6 months for Japan to go from the decision to do so to actually being able to test a device, what would the impact of that decision be on the U.S. ROK alliance and on sunshine policy?
Nick, would you like to get this one?
Complicated? It would complicate things, is that right? Right answer? The complicating structural problem there is that the United States has the hub-spoke thing going in the Pacific, unlike what it had in Europe, right? Because we had the multilateral security network during the Cold War in Western Europe, and since the end of World War II, we've had U.S. bilateral security networks in East Asia and the Pacific. Well, why is that? Well, I guess I'm kind of diplomatic, but I think that the basic idea is that the world had answered the German question, and they neighbors aren't sure that they've answered the Japan question yet. And I don't think that the emergence of Japan as a nuclear power right now would make the neighbors that much more confident that they'd answered the Japan question.
Jay or Balbina, do you want to? No? No. Very complicated set of circumstances that raises. Next question.
Chung-in Lee, sophomore at AU. My question is to any particular panel member. Do you think the Korea-U.S. alliance had a great bonus in Ban Ki-moon, the Korea's foreign minister, becoming the UN Secretary General by overwhelming margin? And with the Korean Secretary General, do you think the UN will be more focused on North Korea issue than before?
Don?
I certainly think it won't hurt. Ban Ki-moon is a very experienced diplomat, and he'll be unlike, I think, some of his predecessors. He's going to be the opposite of being flamboyant, but he's going to be a guy who does his homework, works steadily toward trying to do the job of Secretary General. It certainly won't hurt to have a person as Secretary General who thoroughly understands the situation in Korea. In my view, one of the main problems for the United States and for other countries with regard to the situation in Korea is the lack of understanding, lack of focus, lack of priority given to the situation on the Korean Peninsula. It only intermittently gets the attention of the top leadership of the United States and other countries. So having a Secretary General who knows a great deal about Korea will certainly be a benefit to the situation on the Korean Peninsula. Having said that, the UN, Ban Ki-moon can't wave their hand and make some great change in Korea. It's not possible.
I'd like to just jump in with a question for the ambassador here and take moderator's privilege. One hears a lot when we've mentioned here today the rising anti-American sentiment in South Korea over the past several years. Concurrent with that trend has also been a very quick and improving relationship between Beijing and Seoul. It's often now noted that that is now the largest trading partnership for South Korea is with China. To what degree in this hub and spokes that Nick mentions does the improving relations between Beijing and Seoul complicate the U.S.-ROK relationship?
That's quite sensitive question, but yes, China has become number one trading partner of South Korea. China has become our number one export destination. To the extent economic interdependence between Beijing and Seoul has become very intensified. But that does not necessarily mean that the South Korea is bandwagoning on China. We are still bandwagoning on the United States. Our U.S. alliance is very strong. And also, you will not find any evidence there has been any special relationship between China and ROK. But there has been some, distortion of this, bandwagoning on China by some media. But in actuality, there was no such kinds of things. It is very clear. And if you can come with any counterfactual evidence, I would welcome to hear. Therefore, in a sense, but however, South Korea would not join any effort to portray China as a threat, thereby isolate and contain China, because we strongly believe that can be the source of major instability in Northeast Asia. Then we hope that the United States would, engage with China and really continue to in a partnership relationship with China. In that way, U.S. and China can create peace, stability, and prosperity in Northeast Asia.
Please.
As Chung-in knows very well, in the Korean Peninsula's history, there's quite a tradition of bandwagoning with China. It's known as the Old East Asian Order. It doesn't have a very good reputation on the Korean Peninsula these days. It's called satejui, and which is not a term of great fondness. And to the extent that one pays attention to the historical record, I think that there's a great reason and incentive to think that the South Korean population will be wary of much closer relations in a Chinese embrace. And that's why I'm hoping that Chung-in and all the other good professors in South Korea will be teaching the kids history well.
Let me respond that one. Look, we Koreans had about over 960, the foreign invasions. Great majority, over 900 came from China. Definitely, the 사대주의, flunkism is one thing, but our past experience is another. Definitely, the Nick is tend to focus on the negative side. But for us, what kind of strategic choice? Suppose we, sever tie with the United States. What is our choice? Bandwagon in China, bandwagon in Japan, or just project ourselves as a middle power with a nuclear capability, or declare as permanent neutral state? If we come up with a very sheer calculus, then our best choice is taking side with the United States. Yeah, therefore, you don't mislead us. Clear. Our government position, even Nomin's position, and if whoever becomes the president in South Korea, their calculation will be the same. Therefore, for us, the best choice to continue and strengthen our alliance tie with the United States.
That may be true on a grand strategic level, but on a tactical level, at least if reports, and I know you can't really trust the media, but reports that coming out in papers this week suggest that the South Korean and Chinese position are closer in regard to sanctions towards North Korea than the U.S.-Japanese position. No, so this is just a fleeting moment of disagreement about the most pressing security problem of our time.
No. It is kind of thing, because don't try to push South Korea in the position of choosing either United States and China. The United States is a great hegemonic power. You can embrace all. You have a capability. If you have an intention, I think you can solve the problem. Why you tend to why you tend to polarize Northeast Asia into Club A and Team A or Team B? But I hope you can really become a really hegemonic force of integration and harmony in the region.
Balbina wants to get on this.
For once, I actually agree wholeheartedly with Professor Moon. I'm sure he's very happy to hear this. No, I think we have to be very, very careful when we make these blanket statements and you cite very simple statistics, like the fact that China's bilateral trade with South Korea has actually surpassed the United States. That may well be true, but there's a couple of things that's very misleading. The first thing is you have to look at the nature of the trade. The trade has increased in part because it's South Korean exports of parts and materials to China, which they're assembled and then shipped back to the United States. So, that kind of, interdependence is there. Secondly, China has also surpassed the United States as Japan's largest bilateral trading partner. I don't think anybody in this room believes that Japan has gotten closer to Beijing in the last few years. The point here is that economic trade, first of all, may lead to certain kinds of interdependence. That does not necessarily translate to full cooperation. There is increasing tensions on numerous levels, numerous issue areas between and among South Korea, China, and Japan, despite increased economic exchanges. And I prefer that term, economic exchanges, to interdependence, because I think it's not clear yet exactly what the meaning of all of this is.
Next question.
My name is Elisa Wu, and I'm a member of the California and D.C. Bar. My question is, I guess, to everyone, what everybody thinks of Japan's suggestion of just sort of an absolute economic sanctions, given that it seems like a lot of the money that comes into North Korea doesn't even go to the people of Korea, and it just goes to the government.
Jay?
Well, I guess the question really is a continuation from this morning's panel discussion as to how do you bring North Korea back, and if the sanctions, imposing tighter, stronger sanctions is the way. I think the fundamental question is really to tell Beijing and to really force Beijing to think about what their priorities are. Is propping up Kim Jong-il the single most important foreign policy objective facing Beijing, superseding peaceful eventual reunification with Taiwan or continuing its economic growth. I think to resolve the North Korean nuclear issue, we're going to have to go to that kind of brink. And I think it behooves Washington and Tokyo to really coordinate, and I think the real missing link is Seoul, and it's really unclear that in 2007 December that we're going to have a government in South Korea that might be more willing to go along with D.C. and Tokyo.
But I think the Japanese economic sanctions on North Korea will be less effectual because there are very little left out there. Perhaps the South Korea's punitive measure in terms of suspension of fertilizer and rice to North Korea has been most profound, has brought about the most profound impact on North Korea because in terms of monetary terms, it's about $500 million. But since the test launching of missiles, South Korea suspended the supply of this fertilizer and the rice. Therefore, in other words, South Korea has been most punitive on North Korea, more than the United States and Japan, because the United States and Japan have been imposing sanctions some time before. And apart from that one, I think sanctions cannot be panacea. Sanctions should be combined with diplomatic measures. Therefore, when the Security Council of the United Nations delivers some kind of resolution, South Korea will comply with that resolution 100%. But again, we should seek diplomatic ways of resolving the problem.
As all of you students of history know, the batting average of sanctions and coercive economic diplomacy in the 20th century is pretty miserable. North Korea is not your average exposed to sanctions economy. The North Korean economy is extraordinarily distorted. It's permanently dependent upon ongoing flows of concessional aid from the outside to keep operating. So there's probably more scope for pressure in a program of economic penalties and punishments for the DPRK than for most other revisionist governments when one encounters them. And I think that, to link Chung-in and Jay's comments, I think the road to North Korean allowance reduction in Beijing leads through Seoul, and we've seen some positive steps, but there's plenty more that can be done. We still have this interesting experiment called the Kaesong Industrial Complex, which is an area that eventually, according to current ROK Unification Ministry plans, should be employing hundreds of thousands of people in the north in the future. Might be time for a creative pause and re-examination of that project and the Kumgang tourism project and a lot of other things which actually help the DPRK government to survive at the moment.
Ki-Young with the Sege Times, Korean Daily. I'd like to ask to Dr. Nicholas Eberstadt. You insist that South Korean government should abandon sunshine policy toward North Korea. What's your suggestion? What's your alternative? And then before you answer to my question, how could you explain the historical fact that nothing had happened even though South Korean government took the hostile policy for over 4 decades before Kim Dae-jung government? Thank you.
Well, nothing happened in terms of nuclear weapon development, or what?
No change from the North Korean side.
The DPRK government is a revisionist government, and peculiar as it may sound to well-fed and well-read people, its statement suggests it really still has an unconditional approach to reunification on the Korean peninsula. So I mean, that helps to explain why there was a continuing hostile division. And first question, alternative policy. The ROK, given geographical realities, is always going to have to contend with the DPRK. It's right across a land border with it. So there's always going to have to be some sort of policy that involves, engages, if you like that word, North Korea. What one might want to have is a little bit less dreamy, unconditional, illusory, one-sided approach for a start.
Let me just add one point. This sunshine policy or engagement policy started with a Notae government, which was a conservative government, not with the Kim Dae-jung government. And I would say that even if Grand National Party, the opposition party, conservative party, wins the election, presidential election next year, they will continue to pursue the engagement policy. No other choice, because we do not want war on the Korean Peninsula. Therefore, engagement policy is the only answer. However, not unconditional engagement. There should be fundamental modification of engagement. Okay, it will be much more reciprocal. There will be such a kind of changes, but there is no other choice but engagement, as long as we do not want war on the Korean Peninsula.
Hi, James Kitfield from National Journal Magazine. I've noted in this last few weeks how two members of the Axis of Evil, the Bush administration, is trying desperately to get them to the United Nations Security Council for sanctions. And though the administration doesn't talk about preemption and regime change anymore, I'm curious what the panel thinks about how much that impulse still informs the Bush administration. And I think that's important because if we're trying to rally the world community around a sort of containment of these places, these countries, it seems to me that will be viewed one way. But if it's seen as still strong people in this administration who are really looking for regime change, and that's the end game, there'll be a different approach to how these people are approaching our diplomacy.
If you take the declarations of President Bush, he continues to say that the solution to these problems is by diplomacy. However, I haven't heard the administration reject regime change as an objective. I think that's still an objective of many people within the administration. President Bush's administration, like some in the past, has been divided on this issue, and I think it's still divided on the issue as to what the overall policy toward North Korea should be. But as far as we can see, while there's talk around the fringes of the administration about taking military action against North Korea, there's no indication from the statements and from what we know of the inner workings that this is actually being worked on, or that it's very likely at this moment.
Jay.
And I think we're really in a dilemma with the South Korean perception of this issue, is because even despite the rhetoric from President Bush about resolving this diplomatically, we're not attack North Korea, but there's always but all options are on the table. And this makes South Korean public very, very nervous. And I think as this issue progresses and it becomes more intensified, I think the continuation of that kind of ambivalent rhetoric is really going to put South Korean public on its edge, and that's going to have an impact on how South Korea is going to react to some of the policies.
I'd point out, too, just you might want to check today's Financial Times. There's an excellent piece there that suggests that much of this sort of fatigue that you point to is maybe truly in place, and that there's somewhat of a shift into an older Cold War style policy. Next question.
Okay. Hyung Choi, Muna Daily from Korea. I think we better take into consideration one more fact. I think it's the strategic dilemma from the Korean government's point of view. It seems to me that the Korean government official and Korean government has kept some concern about the concern that North Korea could be another northeastern province of China, like Haejung-Jangsang or something like that, without South Korean government engagement. So, actually, I heard a story from the former Prime Minister Hwang. Actually, at the time he was acting president. At the time, there was a huge blast from North Korea. It was regarded as some kind of military coup for the short time. At the time, Prime Minister Go confessed to me that actually he could not make sleep because he was so concerned about that the North Korean pro-China North Korean military took over the power of North Korea. So if I think the dilemma is like this: if Korean government just stand up firmly with the U.S. and isolate North Korea, if then North Korea could be more dependent on China. So what do you think? How do you think South Korean government should deal with this strategic dilemma?
Balbina?
Oh, jeez.
Oh, I saw you nodding, so that wasn't nodding. Okay, I'm sorry. Ambassador.
Yes, there is increasing dependency of North Korea on China. And particularly there has been increasing number of Chinese investment in North Korea. Therefore, North Korea could become integrated into the Dongbei, the northeastern economic sphere, or what they call Bohai economic development in the sphere. Therefore, we cannot deny that one. But I really don't think there will be any kinds of interference with the sovereignty of North Korea. North Korea might be functionally integrated into the northeastern economic sphere of China, but I really don't think that China would intervene in North Korea in military or political terms. Therefore, I don't see China becoming Syria vis-a-vis in Lebanon.
Of course, coincidence isn't conjuncture isn't causation. But it's an interesting coincidence that the historical rediscovery of Goguryeo in China happened during the heyday of ROK engagement policy with the DPRK, right? Okay, it's still formally an abstract historical discussion in China, but it may not be entirely an abstract historical discussion. If there is some thinking among certain circles in China about, under certain contingencies, the necessity for a sort of a custodial relationship with the northern half of the Korean Peninsula, that seems to me to be all the more reason that the ROK and the United States should coordinate very closely on their military relationship and on their policy towards the rest of the Korean Peninsula, and on contingency plans for peaceful and free unification of the peninsula.
Sir.
Yes, my name is Gustanto. I'm Counselor for Political Affairs from the Indonesian Embassy. My question is directed to Ms. Balbina. You pointed out clearly earlier that there is different perceptions between United States and ROK with regard to the approach that they should have toward the DPRK. My question is, what is the likely future, given the fact that the difference is so deep between the South Korea and the U.S. as far as engagement or sunshine policy is concerned? What is the likely future direction in the triangular relations between these three countries? Thank you.
I'm sorry, your question was directed to
Balbina.
Well, as I said, I think the nuclear test certainly, and it's not just the nuclear test, right? It's the missile launches back in July. But more than that, it is fundamental sort of despair among the general South Korean public. They understand that, in essence, the Sunshine Policy has failed. President No has actually pretty much come out and admitted that. So I think that the point here is we have reached an important crossroads. I do think there will be a reassessment of, I think the Sunshine Policy is dead, in name certainly, but that does not mean engagement policy will end. Again, for all of the same reasons that I stated earlier, and also this panel has also stated. Because ultimately, I don't think South Korea can walk away from some kind of engagement. The question is what the kind of engagement is. And the point about my discussion earlier, discussing the strategic dissonance between the two allies, was not to say that this is fundamentally means that we have to abandon the alliance. My point is that we do share a common threat perception. But again, the point is that it's a very different source of threat. If South Koreans did not view North Korea as a threat at all, then we'd have a problem. And actually, there's no point in continuing the alliance. But again, that's not true. South Koreans do feel threatened by North Korea. So we have to go back to that fundamental sharing of that view, and then work from there on how we address really the difference in the strategies that can take place.
Maybe one last question that I'd like to pose to the ambassador. We seem to have, I think, probably strong or brewing consensus here that the U.S.-ROK alliance is strategically important, must be preserved, and is key going forward. But to tap into something that was in Jay's analysis that we haven't yet touched, looking at sort of the regional interplay of politics and the fact that within South Korea and the fact that we are coming up on a presidential election soon, should the United States, for its part, understand and gear itself for another season of anti-Americanism?
No, I don't think so.
Or maybe I shouldn't say another, because we're certainly still in it, a renewed season of anti-Americanism.
I would argue that the anti-Americanism has been subject to the law of diminishing return. Same for North Korea. Therefore, I really don't think the North Korean issue or American issue can be the major factor that can determine the electoral outcome. It's a law of diminishing return can be applied to those issues.